Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. We will look in this video in one of the most important from the trade perspective changes in the recent years, quite unthinkable even 5 years ago, the decision and the timeline of the European Union to bring to the end the imports of Russian pipeline and liquefied natural gas into the market. And we will do so by looking into the following 3 points. I will first bring this into the historical perspective to appreciate the significance of this change. I will then make a brief summary of those EU international economic sanctions which have so far been introduced and which restricted trade in Russian natural gas. And then we would discuss the current timeline to bring to the end the imports of Russian natural gas into the European Union. To appreciate the significance of this change, we need to look at some numbers. Before the war started in Ukraine, Russia was by far the largest exporter of natural gas into the European Union, which conveniently suited the development of the European industrial base. Total exports of Russian natural gas amounted to 150 billion cubic meters, which was approximately 45–50% of the total EU consumption of natural gas. In some countries, the exports of Russian natural gas exceeded 80–90% of the total consumption. And it's not just because Russia has huge reserves of natural gas and the EU needs this gas for both maintaining its industrial base and facilitating green transition. It's also because from the historical perspective, Russia, and before Russia, the Soviet Union, has for years, for decades, developed its gas infrastructure with a view to supply the gas primarily to the European market. Various pipelines have been constructed over many years, starting with Soyuz, Brotherhood, and Yamal pipelines, which were land pipelines connecting the Russian gas fields, primarily in the Yamal Peninsula, which has huge reserves of gas, with the European market. Those pipelines passed through what is currently Russia, Belarus, Poland, and Germany. That's one set of pipelines. And then the second set of pipelines passed through Russia, Ukraine, then Romania, Slovakia, Austria, Czech Republic, and again Germany, the southern part of those pipelines. These were the investment made over years, including during the period of the Cold War. And for all this period of time, both at the Russian end and the European end, substantial investments were made into the infrastructure and in building that type of relationship. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the importance of Russia as a supplier of gas to the European market has not decreased, but increased, also in part to facilitate the green energy transition. Various other pipelines were built. Some of them passed through the Black Sea, then to Turkey, and then in part those pipelines were equally used to supply gas to the southern part of Europe, to the Balkans primarily, but then also to Austria as well. Those were so-called Blue Stream and Turk Stream pipelines. The Blue Stream pipeline passes to the Asian part of Turkey, and the Turk Stream pipeline passes to the European part of Turkey, and then in part supply the gas to the national market, Turkey, and then specifically Turk Stream pipeline to the Balkan region. But also the same sets of pipelines were constructed with the view to supply gas to the main supplier out of all European economies by scale, Germany, through the Baltics. These were the so-called Nord Stream pipelines, out of which one became operational and the second one was supposed to become operational. So all in all, it's not just about the volume, but it's also about the history of relationship, which lasted for, as I said, decades. It's also about the infrastructure built to bring this gas to the main supplier. And it's not surprising, given all these efforts and given all these investments, that even now in 2026, when the EU introduced one of the harshest sanctions regimes restricting trade between Russia and the European Union, European Union still remains the main consumer of Russian pipeline gas. Certainly, those numbers substantially decreased. Nevertheless, as we can see on this chart, the European Union still maintains the first place in this gas supply. And the reason for this is quite simple. This type of historical ties and historical relationships are, at some moment, seem to be quasi impossible to bring to an end. We can see on this chart that whilst the consumption of the Russian pipeline gas has decreased since 2022, and that primarily occurred due to no specific sanctions or restrictions affecting the pipeline gas, but primarily due to most of those pipelines becoming inoperational. Blue Stream, Nord Stream pipelines were blown up, so they were not able to bring any further gas to the European Union. The Soyuz pipeline, which was bringing gas through the territory of Belarus, Poland, and Germany, is not operational again. And then the contract for the supply of natural gas through the territory of Ukraine came to an end, and accordingly was not renewed given the current war between Russia and Ukraine. So all in all, by now, most of the Russian gas which is coming to the European market is actually coming through the southern pipelines, which go through Turkey, primarily Turk Stream, and then upwards to the Balkans and those European states which continue to purchase Russian natural gas, primarily Hungary, Slovakia, and Austria. Conversely, and quite surprisingly, the exports of Russian LNG to Europe has increased since the start of the war, because Europe is reliant on natural gas and it's impossible to find substitutes for those volumes which became unavailable. And we can see that the European Union is one of the largest consumers of Russian LNG, consuming more than 50% and quite substantially exceeding the other consumers, being China and Japan. Given this dependency of the European economies on the Russian natural gas, it's not that surprising that for a very long period of time, there were no substantial sanctions introduced in Russian gas sector, and the trade between European Union and Russia in natural gas has largely been uninterrupted up until 2022. And those sanctions, which were introduced even at the beginning of the war, largely affected the capacity of the Russian energy giants to borrow debt in the EU capital markets or from the EU banks, or trade in certain technologies necessary for the development of gas fields or the maintenance of gas infrastructure, but did not directly affect the trade in the commodity as such. And as we discussed, the reasons for the decrease in the trade of at least pipeline gas were largely unrelated to sanctions. They were due to the physical inability of the pipeline to pipe the gas due to various technical interruptions which occurred for various reasons, or the interruption of the supply of contracts through the territory of Ukraine as such. Conversely, LNG continued to develop as it was less affected by the physical interruptions than the pipeline natural gas. And to the surprise of many people, the exports increased over the last 4 years. And accordingly, the focus of the European restrictions affecting the trade in natural gas as such has so far been largely focused on the LNG itself, where we could see various incremental steps being introduced by the European Union, starting from the limited import embargo through those LNG terminals were not interconnected to the natural gas system. There were quite few of them, primarily in the Nordic countries. So the measure was of more symbolic rather than practical significance to the trade as such. But then certainly more substantial restrictions were introduced, starting with the prohibition for the LNG transshipment and following with the overall prohibition of imports of LNG, which with respect to short-term contracts for a period of less than 1 year is already effective, starting from April, and with respect to the longer-term contracts will be effective beginning next year. But nevertheless, a really important from the historical perspective development was the decision of the European Union formally to set the end dates for the overall trade in Russian natural gas, including the pipeline natural gas, which was introduced by Regulation 2026-261, which formally set the 17th of June as the end date for the short-term contracts for the supply of Russian pipeline gas, and the end of September next year for the long-term contracts. This is a historically important measure, given that many contracts which are concluded between the suppliers and the buyers of Russian natural gas are long-term contracts, for sure will result in multiple litigations in connection with the termination of those contracts. But leaving those points aside, taking a historical view on this, the formal decision to end the supply of Russian natural gas to the European Union is quite remarkable in itself. It is not only that the regulation puts the formal end dates for the purchase of Russian natural gas, it is also that a special authorization procedure is put in place, which, even with respect to existing contracts, in essence, will put in place better supervision and control mechanism over the origin of gas, the purchases of gas, and the terms of the contracts under which the gas is supplied. Similarly, a new set of penalties is introduced. Those are supposed to be implemented at the national levels of the EU member states, but they complement the overall prohibition and to avoid any attempts to rebrand Russian natural gas and resell the gas originating from other jurisdictions, for example, Azerbaijan, as Russian gas into the European Union. So all in all, certainly to some extent, the measure was very well expected, and the natural destructions or physical destruction of pipeline, which we've discussed, somehow made it inevitable. But nevertheless, the formal decision of the European Union is certainly an important and quite remarkable milestone in the trade relationship between these two jurisdictions. Thank you very much for watching. I trust that you found this presentation useful, and I hope to see you during my next presentations.